Gospel Topics Essays, Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints, Part 2. In this series I will thoroughly examine the Gospel Topics essays published on the official LDS Church website. Each essay will be addressed in the order presented by the Church, offering a critical and in-depth analysis of the topics they cover. Since this topic essay is lengthy, I will be breaking it down into a two-part episode. Part 1. Violence and Vigilantism in the 19th Century United States. Let's begin by examining the LDS Church's opening statement. In 19th century American society, community violence was common and often condoned. Much of the violence perpetrated by and against Latter-day Saints fell within the then-existing American tradition of extra-legal vigilantism, in which citizens organized to take justice into their own hands when they believed government was either oppressive or lacking. Vigilantes generally targeted minority groups or those perceived to be criminal or socially marginal. Such acts were at times fueled by religious rhetoric. The existence of community-based militias also contributed to this culture of vigilantism. Congress passed a law in 1792 requiring every able-bodied male between 18 and 45 years of age to belong to a community militia. Over time, the militias turned into the National Guard, but in early America, they were often unruly, perpetrating acts of violence against individuals or groups perceived to be opponents of the community. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Latter-day Saints communities in Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, and Utah were all located in the western frontier regions of the United States, where community violence was readily sanctioned. While vigilantism was a widespread reality in 19th century America, it was often a direct response to weak or corrupt law enforcement. Communities took the law into their own hands through lynchings, mob violence, and retaliatory attacks. The Mormons weren't just settling peacefully, they were actively seizing power, installing their own leaders as mayors, sheriffs, and judges, effectively taking over local governance. Non-Mormons saw this as an existential threat, and who can blame them for banding together in self-defense? The idea that the Saints were purely on the receiving end of persecution is a one-sided myth that ignores their role in escalating tension. The LDS narrative conveniently leaves out the inconvenient truth. They weren't just passive victims in this saga. They were active perpetrators of violence, especially on the plains from the 1840s onward. Let's be clear, not all of it was self-defense. While minorities were often targets, vigilante groups also went after anyone they saw as a threat, whether it was corrupt officials, political rivals, or criminals, real or imagined. The Mormons were viewed as a serious threat, and with good reason. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and the rest of the leadership had reputations tainted with criminal actions and a slew of charges hanging over their head. Part 2. The Mormon-Missouri War and the Danites. Let's once again start with a statement by the Church. The isolated acts of violence committed by some Latter-day Saints can generally be seen as a subset of the broader phenomenon of frontier violence in 19th century America. In 1838, Joseph Smith and other church members fled from mobs in Ohio and moved to Missouri, where Latter-day Saints had already established settlements. Joseph Smith believed that opposition from church dissidents and other antagonists had weakened and ultimately destroyed their community in Kirtland, Ohio, where only 2 years before they had completed a temple at great sacrifice. By the summer of 1838, church leaders saw the rise of similar threats to their goal of creating a harmonious community in Missouri. The church is outright lying. Joseph Smith wasn't running from any so-called mob in Ohio. As we exposed in the last video, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon were slapped with heavy fines for running the illegal Kirtland Safety Society, a fraudulent banking scheme that collapsed and wiped out the life savings of countless followers. With leadership turning against them and the law demanding payment, did Joseph stand and face the consequences? Of course not. He and Rigdon fled like cowards to far west Missouri, dodging both legal accountability and furious former believers. And yet the Church dares to spin this as mob persecution? Give me a break. By the summer of 1838, there was no sudden, unprovoked rise against the so-called Saints. Let's not forget, June of that year saw the formation of the Danites, a militant Mormon group, alongside Sidney Rigdon's infamous Salt Sermon, which all but declared war on dissenters and outsiders. Every act of hostility against the Mormons can be traced back to their own aggression and violence, sparking retaliation rather than persecution. Now, this isn't to excuse the actions of the Missourians. Both sides were guilty of brutality. But let's be clear, the church manufactured its own persecution. Period. The church continues on with, at the Latter-day Saints settlement of Far West, some leaders and members organized a paramilitary group known as the Danites, whose objective was to defend the community against dissident and excommunicated Latter-day Saints as well as other Missourians. Historians generally concur that Joseph Smith approved of the Danites, but that he probably was not briefed on all their plans and likely did not sanction the full range of their activities. There was no violence coming from excommunicated members. The members being spoken of were Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, who were excommunicated for speaking out against Joseph Smith and his abuse of authority and power. Joseph knew exactly what the Danites were up to, and even recorded it in his journal. The church proceeds with, Danites intimidated church dissenters and other Missourians. For instance, they warned some dissenters to leave Caldwell County. During the fall of 1838, as tensions escalated during what is now known as the Mormon-Missouri War, the Danites were apparently absorbed into militias largely composed of Latter-day Saints. These militias clashed with their Missouri opponents, leading to a few fatalities on both sides. In addition, Mormon vigilantes, including many Danites, raided two towns believed to be centers of anti-Mormon activity, burning homes and stealing goods. Though the existence of the Danites was short-lived, it resulted in a long-standing and much embellished myth about a secret society of Mormon vigilantes. It's well documented that the Danites were tasked with enforcing loyalty within the Mormon community and used intimidation against dissenters. Their role in enforcing the Mormon leadership's will through coercion and intimidation is a recognized part of the historical record. There is just no way around it. The Danites attacked the towns of DeWitt and Gallatin. These attacks followed tensions that began during the August 6, 1838, Election Day riot in Gallatin, where Mormons were being barred from voting. Later that year, the Danites, under orders from church leaders, looted and burned the town, forcing its residents to flee. Gallatin was one of several settlements targeted in a campaign to drive non-Mormons from the area. Let's see where the church takes us next. As a result of their experience in Missouri, the Latter-day Saints created a large state-sanctioned militia, the Nauvoo Legion, to protect themselves after they moved to Illinois. This militia was feared by many who saw the Latter-day Saints as enemies, but the Legion avoided offensive or retaliatory action. It did not respond even in the crisis leading up to the mob murders of Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram in June 1844, or in the aftermath of those murders. When the governor of Illinois ordered that the Legion disband, the Saints followed the instruction. The claim that the Nauvoo Legion was purely defensive and never engaged in offensive or retaliatory action is misleading. While the Mormons had legitimate concerns about their safety after Missouri, the Nauvoo Legion was far from a passive militia. It was one of the largest military forces in Illinois, commanded directly by Joseph Smith, who held the title of Lieutenant General, a rank that no other militia leader in the state possessed. Smith openly used the Legion to assert power, even declaring martial law in Nauvoo in June 1844, a direct challenge to Illinois state authority. The Legion also engaged in aggressive actions, including the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor Press, which set the stage for Smith's arrest and eventual death. Additionally, historical records indicate that members of the Legion threatened dissenters and critics, creating an atmosphere of intimidation rather than mere self-defense. While the Nauvoo Legion technically disbanded upon state orders, this was after Smith's death and under extreme pressure. The notion that they simply followed instructions ignores the broader context of their militarized presence and the fear it instilled in surrounding communities. Part 3. Violence in Utah Territory. The church continues on with, in Utah, aggression or retaliation by Latter-day Saints against their perceived enemies occurred most frequently during the first decade of settlement, 1847-1857. For many, the scars of former persecutions and the trek to the Rocky Mountains were still fresh and personal. As they tried to carve out a living in the Utah desert, the Saints faced continuing conflict. Many factors worked against the success of the Latter-day Saint venture in Utah. Tensions with American Indians, who had been displaced by Mormon settlement and expansion, Pressure from the U.S. federal government, particularly after the public announcement of plural marriage in 1852, uncertain land claims, and a rapidly expanding population. Community leaders felt an unrelenting burden of responsibility, not only for the spiritual welfare of the church, but also for the physical survival of their people. Many of these leaders, including church president and territorial governor Brigham Young, simultaneously held ecclesiastical and civil offices. This is a textbook attempt to justify early Mormon aggression in Utah by painting the saints as perpetual victims, reacting to persecution and harsh conditions rather than actively engaging in violence. But let's be clear, the aggression wasn't just reactionary, it was strategic. Yes, tensions existed with American Indians, but Mormons weren't just innocent settlers caught in conflict. They raided, killed, and enslaved Native Americans, particularly during the Walker War, 1853-1854, and the brutal Bear River Massacre, 1863, which involved LDS-aligned militias. The narrative that Brigham Young and his men were merely burdened leaders trying to protect their people conveniently ignores the destruction of anti-Mormon opposition, the violent enforcement of LDS authority, and the militant theocracy Young built in Utah. The first decade of Utah settlement wasn't just about survival. It was about consolidating absolute power through force and fear. The church's statement that they faced pressure from the U.S. federal government, particularly after the public announcement of plural marriage in 1852, completely ignores a critical fact. Plural marriage was illegal under U.S. law. The Mormons weren't innocent victims of government persecution. They were openly defying the law. Of course, the federal government intervened, because the LDS leadership was running an outlaw theocracy that openly rejected national authority. The claim about uncertain land claims is another distortion. The Mormons were squatting on land that wasn't legally theirs, ignoring federal jurisdiction while pretending to be an independent nation. Brigham Young's government wasn't just a church. It was an authoritarian regime that saw itself above the law. Part 4. Latter-day Saints' relationship with American Indians. Let's hear what the church states here. Like other settlers in frontier areas, Latter-day Saints occupied areas already inhabited by American Indians. The tragic history of the annihilation of many Indian tribes and the devastation of others at the hands of European immigrant settlers and the United States military and political apparatus has been well documented by historians. Settlers throughout the 19th century, including some Latter-day Saints, mistreated and killed Indians in numerous conflicts, forcing them off desirable lands and onto reservations. Unlike most other Americans, Latter-day Saints viewed Indians as a chosen people, fellow Israelites who were descendants of Book of Mormon peoples and thus heirs to God's promises. As church president, territorial governor, and territorial superintendent of Indian affairs, Brigham Young pursued a peace policy to facilitate Mormon settlement in areas where Indians lived. Latter-day Saints learned Indian languages, established trade relations, preached the gospel, and generally sought accommodation with Indians. This policy, however, emerged unevenly and was inconsistently applied. The church's attempt to whitewash its history with Native Americans is nothing short of revisionist propaganda. While they claim Brigham Young pursued a peace policy, the reality was far more brutal. Mormon settlers, like other expansionist groups, forcibly displaced, mistreated, and outright slaughtered Native peoples when it suited their interests. The so-called peace policy was nothing more than a strategic move to secure land while minimizing resistance. Brigham Young himself made it clear where his priorities lay, stating in 1854, "It is cheaper to feed the Indians than to fight them." This wasn't about benevolence. It was a calculated approach to maintain control. Yet when diplomacy failed, violence followed. Young's supposed peace stance didn't stop him from saying in 1850, "Treat them kindly, and treat them kindly again, until you are obliged to fight them." And let's talk about this ridiculous claim that the Saints viewed Native Americans as chosen people. That didn't stop them from enslaving Indian children, a practice Young openly endorsed. Buy up the Lamanite children and educate them and teach them the gospel, so that many generations will not pass ere they become a white and delightsome people. 852. This was nothing more than a religious justification for human trafficking. Then there were the violent conflicts like the Walker War, 1853 to 1854, and the Black Hawk War, 1865 to 1872, in which Mormon militias engaged in brutal skirmishes with native tribes who resisted their land grabs. The saints spoke of civilizing the Lamanites, yet they were more than willing to push them onto reservations, as Young declared in 1866. The only safe way to deal with this barbarous race is to exterminate them. The church wants to paint itself as different from other American settlers, but the facts say otherwise. They were colonizers just like the rest, only with religious justification. The church proceeds with, nevertheless, for the most part, the saints had more amicable relations with Indians than did settlers in other areas of the American West. Brigham Young enjoyed friendships with several American Indian leaders and taught his people to live peacefully with their Indian neighbors whenever possible. Some Indians even distinguished between Mormonese, whom they considered friendly, and other American settlers who were known as Maricat. The idea that the saints had more amicable relations with Native Americans than other settlers is a convenient myth that ignores the reality of Mormon expansion in the West. While Brigham Young preached peace when it was beneficial, he had no problem resorting to violence, displacement, and enslavement when diplomacy failed. Yes, Young had alliances with certain native leaders, but these relationships were largely strategic, designed to maintain control over land and prevent costly conflicts. Even his so-called friendliness was laced with racial superiority, as he declared in 1855, "You may say that the Indians are of the house of Israel. Well, they are, and a great many of them will be saved, but they are far more ignorant than the children of the streets." Let's talk about this claim that some native groups saw Mormonese as friendlier than Maricats. That didn't stop Mormon settlers from participating in violent conflicts like the Walker 1853 to 1854 and Black Hawk War 1865 to 1872, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of native people. Nor did it stop Young from approving the enslavement of native children, as he openly stated in 1852, "They are the most degraded, miserable beings upon the earth. Take the Lamanite children and educate them, and they will become a white and delightsome people." Mormon settlers, like other colonizers, pushed native peoples off their land, exploited them for labor, and responded with violence when they resisted. The idea that the saints were somehow better than other settlers is just another attempt to rewrite history. Part 5. The Reformation and the Utah War. In the mid-1850s, a reformation within the church and tensions between the Latter-day Saints in Utah and the U.S. federal government contributed to a siege mentality and a renewed sense of persecution that led to several episodes of violence committed by church members. Concerned about spiritual complacency, Brigham Young and other church leaders delivered a series of sermons in which they called the saints to repent and renew their spiritual commitments. Many testified that they became better people because of this reformation. 19th century Americans were accustomed to violent language, both religious and otherwise. Throughout the century, revivalists had used violent imagery to encourage the unconverted to repent and to urge backsliders to reform. At times during the Reformation, President Young, his counselor Jedediah M. Grant, and other leaders preached with fiery rhetoric, warning against the evils of those who dissented from or opposed the church. Drawing on biblical passages, particularly from the Old Testament, leaders taught that some sins were so serious that the perpetrator's blood would have to be shed in order to receive forgiveness. Such preaching led to increased strain between the Latter-day Saints and the relatively few non-Mormons in Utah, including federally appointed officials. The so-called Reformation of the mid-1850s was less about spiritual renewal and more about tightening control over the saints through fear, violence, and unquestioning obedience. Brigham Young and his inner circle, particularly Jedediah M. Grant, unleashed some of the most extreme rhetoric in LDS history, promoting the idea that disobedience and dissent warranted bloodshed. Jedediah Grant made this horrifyingly clear in 1856. "What shall we do with the people? I say, cut them off from the earth." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. This was the era of blood atonement, the belief that some sins were so severe that the sinner had to be killed to achieve salvation. Brigham Young echoed this sentiment, stating in 1857, "If you find your brother in sin, shed his blood." This reformation didn't just lead to empty threats. It fueled real violence, intensifying conflicts with federal officials and non-Mormon settlers in Utah. The most infamous result? The church downplays the connection between violent rhetoric and real-world bloodshed, but the facts speak for themselves. The Utah Reformation was a time of fear, paranoia, and brutal enforcement of religious loyalty, not some noble spiritual awakening. We then get from the church. In early 1857, U.S. President James Buchanan received reports from some of the federal officials alleging that Governor Young and the Latter-day Saints in Utah were rebelling against the authority of the federal government. A strongly worded memorial from the Utah legislature to the federal government convinced federal officials the reports were true. President Buchanan decided to replace Brigham Young as governor and, in what became known as the Utah War, sent an army to Utah to escort his replacement. Latter-day Saints feared that the oncoming army, some 1,500 troops with more to follow, would renew the depredations of Missouri and Illinois, and again drive the Saints from their home. In addition, Parley P. Pratt, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, was murdered in Arkansas in May 1857. News of the murder, as well as newspaper reports from the eastern United States that celebrated the crime, reached Utah in late June 1857. As these events unfolded, Brigham Young declared martial law in the territory, directed missionaries and settlers in outlying areas to return to Utah, and guided preparations to resist the army. Defiant sermons given by President Young and other church leaders, combined with the impending arrival of an army, helped create an environment of fear and suspicion in Utah. The church's narrative conveniently portrays the Utah War as an unjustified federal attack on peaceful settlers, but the reality is far more damning. Brigham Young had spent years defying federal authority, and by 1857, the U.S. government had every reason to suspect that Utah was operating as an independent theocracy under his absolute rule. The Saints weren't just defying local authorities, they were openly breaking federal law by practicing plural marriage, which had been declared illegal in the United States by this law specifically targeted polygamy, and the federal government had warned the Mormons multiple times to stop. Yet, Young and his followers flouted the law, boldly continuing the practice of plural marriage in direct violation of federal policy. Reports from federal officials described a hostile, lawless environment where non-Mormons were harassed, threatened, and in some cases outright murdered. Buchanan's decision to replace Young as governor was not a baseless attack on religious freedom. It was a response to real concerns about Utah's open defiance of federal law. Instead of peacefully transferring power, Young declared martial law, mobilized the Nauvoo Legion, and ordered a scorched earth campaign, instructing his people to burn their own settlements rather than let the U.S. Army occupy them. He was preparing for war, not peace. And let's talk about the Parley P. Pratt angle, because the church loves using it to justify their paranoia. Pratt was murdered by the legal husband of a woman he had taken as a plural wife, a clear consequence of polygamy's destructive nature. Yet the Saints saw his death as martyrdom and used it to fuel their siege mentality. Part 6. The Mountain Meadows Massacre. The church starts this section off with, at the peak of this tension, on early September 11, 1857, a branch of the territorial militia in southern Utah, composed entirely of Mormons, along with some Indians they recruited, laid siege to a wagon train of emigrants traveling from Arkansas to California. As the wagon train traveled south from Salt Lake City, the emigrants had clashed verbally with local Mormons over where they could graze their cattle. Some of the members of the wagon train became frustrated because they had difficulty purchasing much-needed grain and other supplies from local settlers, who had been instructed to save their grain as a wartime policy. Aggrieved, some of the emigrants threatened to join incoming troops in fighting against the Saints. The church is feeding us half-truths here, but let's expose the real narrative. Brigham Young didn't just issue vague wartime policies. He outright ordered that church members were prohibited from selling or trading with non-Mormons. This wasn't some strategic maneuver for survival. It was a calculated power play. The Fancher Baker Party was deliberately denied supplies in Salt Lake City, which they desperately needed to continue their journey. The excuse of saving supplies for wartime is nothing more than a convenient cop-out. Young was flexing his authority over those passing through, particularly non-Mormon immigrants. This was about asserting control, not about safeguarding resources for an imagined war. Let's call it what it was: blatant manipulation of resources to tighten the grip on everyone who wasn't part of his church. The church is technically correct when it acknowledges that members of the wagon parties threatened to align with the U.S. military, but let's not ignore the full context. These emigrants were denied essential supplies and were left stranded, unable to continue their journey westward or south into Mexico. The church tries to spin the narrative by claiming the Fancher-Baker party taunted the Mormons, invoking the Haun's Mill attack and spreading rumors about those involved in Parley P. Pratt's death. However, these rumors came from Pratt's plural wife, who wasn't even there when he was killed. The supposed taunts are nothing but a desperate attempt by the church to justify the bloodshed in 1857. Let's be clear, this wasn't about self-defense or provocation. It was about creating a justification for a massacre. The church continues on with, although some saints ignored these threats, other local church leaders and members in Cedar City, Utah, advocated violence. Isaac C. Haight, a stake president and militia leader, sent John D. Lee, a militia major, to lead an attack on the emigrant company. When the president reported the plan to his council, other leaders objected and requested that he call off the attack and instead send an express rider to Brigham Young in Salt Lake City for guidance. But the men Haight had sent to attack the emigrants carried out their plans before they received the order not to attack. The emigrants fought back, and a siege ensued. 2 Latter-day Saints were eventually excommunicated from the church for their participation, and a grand jury that included Latter-day Saints indicted 9 men. Only one participant, John D. Lee, was convicted and executed for the crime, which fueled false allegations that the massacre had been ordered by Brigham Young. On Sunday, September 6, 1857, during a stake high council meeting after church services, Haight raised the question of how to deal with the emigrants. The idea of orchestrating a Native American-led massacre was considered, though not all council members supported this approach. The council ultimately decided to delay any action until Haight could seek Brigham Young's guidance. The following day, James Haslam was dispatched on a 6-day round-trip horseback journey to Salt Lake City to deliver the urgent request for advice. However, after the council meeting, Haight sent a messenger south to John D. Lee. While what Haight communicated to Lee remains unclear, the timing suggests it may have been related to the council's discussions about waiting for Young's instructions. There's a critical discrepancy in the timeline that needs addressing. James Haslam was dispatched on a 6-day round trip to Salt Lake City right after the High Council meeting on September 6. Given that the massacre occurred the following day, September 7th, and according to the Mormon History Association, Brigham Young received the news on the same day as the attack, we're effectively cutting 2 days from the timeline. This raises a crucial question. Was the High Council meeting held earlier than reported? Given that Young was informed of the proposed attack on the very day it occurred, why did it take him 3 days to respond? This delay is perplexing and raises serious questions about the timing and effectiveness of his response. John D. Lee stated before his death, "I have always believed, since that day, that General George A. Smith was then visiting southern Utah to prepare the people for the work of exterminating Captain Fancher's train of emigrants, and I now believe that he was sent for that purpose by the direct command of Brigham Young." The knowledge of how George A. Smith felt towards the emigrants, and his telling me that he had a long talk with Haight on the subject, made me certain that it was the wish of the church authorities that Fancher and his train should be wiped out. And knowing all this, I did not doubt then, and I do not doubt it now either, that Haight was acting by full authority from the church leaders, and that the orders he gave to me were just the orders that he had been directed to give when he ordered me to raise the Indians and have them attack the emigrants. I will not cover any more on the Mountain Meadow massacres, as I have a full video dedicated to the topic. If you want to know more on this, check out that video. The church closes out with, aside from the Mountain Meadows massacre, a few Latter-day Saints committed other violent acts against a small number of dissenters and outsiders. Some Latter-day Saints perpetrated acts of extra-legal violence, especially in the 1850s, when fear and tensions were prevalent in Utah Territory. The heated rhetoric of church leaders directed toward dissenters may have led these Mormons to believe that such actions were justified. The perpetrators of these crimes were generally not punished. Even so, Many allegations of such violence are unfounded, and anti-Mormon writers have blamed church leaders for many unsolved crimes or suspicious deaths in early Utah. The church's defense of its violent actions in Utah Territory is riddled with contradictions and attempts at absolution. While it's true that a few Latter-day Saints committed violent acts against dissenters and outsiders, to claim that these were isolated or unpunished is misleading. The church leadership not only tolerated but at times encouraged this violence, with leaders like Brigham Young preaching fiery rhetoric that justified extreme measures against those perceived as enemies. To suggest these acts were merely the result of fear and tensions is an oversimplification. The actions of these Latter-day Saints were far from random. They were rooted in a culture of religious extremism and a belief that dissent could be violently suppressed. The Church's dismissal of these allegations as unfounded is nothing short of an attempt to rewrite history. The crimes and deaths that went unsolved are not mere suspicious accidents, but part of a pattern of intimidation and extralegal violence that was allowed, if not condoned, by the church hierarchy. To ignore these facts is to deny the reality of how the saints built their theocratic society, one built on coercion, violence, and the unchecked power of their leaders.